Today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming a wonderful colleague and brilliant researcher, John Daigle. John is a professor in the School of Resources and a faculty fellow in the Mitchell Center and a citizen member in the Penobscot Nation. Remember my comment about no quick fixes to these sustainability challenges? So I'm going to let John tell most of this story, but I'll point out that John began working on this issue, which has to do with an invasive forest pest, the emerald ash borer. He began working on this with Darren Ranko, another faculty member and faculty fellow in the Mitchell Center, together with other faculty, students, and partners way back in 2009. So around 13 years ago, many years before this invasive forest pest came anywhere close to Maine. But they had good reason to think it would get here eventually. And unfortunately, they pretty quickly figured out with a lot of experts around the table in these conversations that there wouldn't be a way to eradicate this pest, as there have for some, but not this one. So that if they were going to minimize the expected impact of the emerald ash borer, it would require a lot of work. And that impact isn't just about, say, the economic impact on ash trees, but also the impact on Wabanaki Lifeways. So they've brought together this great partnership. You're going to hear more about that. Includes other faculty and students, the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance, the tribal nations in places like Michigan that were an important partner to kind of understand what kind of challenges we might face here because it got there first, this pest. And really good partnerships with government, both the U.S. Forest Service and the Maine Forest Service. And in fact, today, John is going to be joined by Allison Canody, who's the Director of Forest Health and Monitoring with the Maine Forest Service, and Colleen Tierling, who's a forest entomologist. Actually, they're both forest entomologists. I was an entomologist way back. So it's especially nice that they can join. And this is a really amazing example. I'm not sure there are very many like this in our country of a long-term collaboration like this that has brought so many different people together towards tackling a really challenging problem. John, the floor is yours. Please join me in welcoming John and his colleagues.
Because there's a lot of people that have contributed to this effort, and including many that have been involved with basket making prior to the EAB arrival. And I just want to acknowledge my grandparents who were basket makers. Used to help them make those baskets, and you never realize later on in life that you'd be actually dealing with something like this. And I'm excited too to talk with the students after today's presentation, because I was an undergrad when I took these photos back in the mid-'80s. And I did a lot of outdoor activities with my grandparents, but the first time I had my 35mm new camera, I took these photos in the mid-'80s. And so I've got a real appreciation for cultural lifeways, and even more of an appreciation after this work over the past 13 years, working with folks, with other basket makers, basketry harvesters. And I thought the best way, as tribal elder Richard Sillaboy, who's been part of this effort since the beginning, because I think he does a really good job kind of given the context of EAB and also just basket making as a cultural lifeway. It's a short video, about 7 minutes, but I think it's well worth the time.
Laalin ke dolke no mena la gesko. Ju laalin ke lokala. our creation story for the Wabanaki people, and that's the 4 tribes. It's not Adam and Eve. The Creator put Galuskab on the earth, and the earth was barren. And Galuskab created, the trees and the grass, and also created the animals. And then he realized that he needed something to take care of the animals and take care of Mother Earth. He took his bow and arrow and he shot it into a brown ash tree, splitting the brown ash tree open, and out came the natives dancing and singing. Our relationship with the forest, it's just that, it's always been very sacred to us. And a lot of our medicines are in the trees and in the ground and the woods. And of course the brown ash tree is very sacred to us. Bear tracks. This here is brown ash. These are the leaves on the brown ash. You notice the leaf is right on this main stem. If you see a leaf right on the stem, you know that's brown ash. If it's white ash, it'll have a little twig between the main stem and the leaf. The biggest threat to the brown ash right now is the emerald ash borer that came into the country back in the mid-90s, and they didn't identify it until 2002. Came in on the pallets. They didn't process the pallets before they put it on the ship, and when they brought it into the Great Lakes area in Michigan, they dropped off the pallets along with the emerald ash borer, the larvae, and it just continued to spread. It spread from Michigan right to southern Maine, and also it come across Quebec. It's now into northern Maine. We have about 6 towns quarantined up there, northern Maine, and hopefully they can slow it down. I know they can't stop it. They haven't stopped it yet. Each year it'll multiply that much more and it'll spread that much faster. Black ash is the only tree that you can pound and separates the year's growth. The year's growth is this year's inner bark will be next year's splint. And depending on the nutrition that the tree gets will depend on the thickness of that next year's splint. And when you pound that, it breaks the fibers between the year's growth, and each splint will separate. And that's what we use to make our baskets out of. Basket making is the oldest art in the Northeast. And before we started using brown ash, we was using birch bark. Mother raised 8 of us. There was 7 boys and 1 girl. And she did stoop labor, raking blueberries and picking potatoes. She'd cut potato seed in the spring. Once in a while she'd be out in the field harvesting broccoli or cauliflower. But anytime she wasn't working stoop labor, she would be making baskets. When I was young, the boys all lived at home, and they would work for the local farmers. But at night, when they come home, they would help mother make baskets. Come living in town, you don't see the stars, you don't get to enjoy the moon, and I come out here and it was just pitch dark at night. And I'd come out and stand in the cold and watch the stars, and the Milky Way. That's my favorite place here in the evenings, is sitting out here and watching the stars. You can see the flying stars. Working with the brown ash, it's very spiritual. When I'm working on a basket, you know, I'm using something that very sacred to all the Wabanaki people. If the climate change or the emerald ash borer was to totally wipe out the brown ash, it would be very devastating for the Wabanaki people of the Northeast. They're saying 50 years from now, there'll be no ash in this area because everything's just moving north. We're collecting seeds and we're gonna store them and preserve them, and hopefully at some point in time we can be able to replant. Name, date, and my tribe. Mi'kmaq. That's the native pronunciation of the word Micmac. Micmac is the European version. So now it's done.
As you can tell, Richard is a good storyteller, huh? And so you can see here, you know, some of the things that Richard talked about in terms of the cultural significance. But, you know, as we think about our ash, it really is important for other reasons too. My talk today is going to focus a little bit more on the cultural, but I just wanted to recognize some of these other really important values, and that is the ecological significance of ash. And again, I learned early on with some of our, at our meetings with some of the basketry harvesters and some of the relationships they would see, and the different characteristics of black ash, where they grow, and what species they grow by. So I got a sense of that. And, you know, clearly I think there are important ecological relationships that ash tree plays. You know, the leaves tend to leaf out later than other trees. It provides that sunlight to come down, warm that soil. Trout lilies, trilliums love that type of environment. Its leaves, when they do fall, have less lignin, and they tend to deteriorate more quickly and creates more nutrients in that soil, much more quickly than oak leaves. And so there are these special ecological relationships that we need to learn more about, I think, with ash. Not alone, you know, the hydrology regulations, particularly for green and black, that tend to be in wetland areas. So I don't know if you can notice in the picture here, University of Maine, that's the mall area. That's green ash that lines the mall. And on which is the north side, on the south side of the library, is cultivated white ash. And it's, again, not uncommon, you know, for aesthetic reasons. A lot of street trees are green, and other ash species that provide a lot of aesthetic enjoyment for people. And there's also the economic value. It's estimated commercial unprocessed value of ash in Maine is $320 million. So there's certainly, particularly with the white ash, economic value in some of our ash trees. And David mentioned my colleague, Darren Ranko. And this is him giving a TED Talk in Portland, Maine, a few years back, 5 years ago. And Darren is the associate professor in the anthropology. He's also the director of the Wabanaki Center here at the University of Maine. A phenomenal co-colleague doing this work over the years. I've really enjoyed working with Darren. We actually share a great grandmother who were basket makers. He refers to EAB as a wicked problem. What's a wicked problem? Well, it's kind of defined as something that is really complicated and with a lot of uncertainty around it, where it really needs a lot of deep thinking, different perspectives, politically, policy. There's a lot of different dimensions in terms of thinking about addressing EAB. And of course, it's a long term, right? We will be working with EAB for many years to come. So it's really a wicked problem. And so one of the things that Darren and I wanted to do early on was, like David again talked about, having a framework that brought people together and thinking about some kind of knowledge to action. What can we do? Is there things that we can actually do to start addressing this problem? I'm sorry if that title slides are being kind of blocked by that top screen there. But early on, there was involvement with a number of individuals from, just to learn more about this emerald ash borer. And we had involvement by the Maine Forest Service, Dave Struble, who was in Allison Canody's position prior to her taking over that position. And Colleen Tierling was at our very first meetings from the Maine Forest Service side, U.S. Forest Service side, and also the APHIS, Animal Health Plant Inspection Service, because they were regulating, the movement of ash. So they've been a strong partner over the years. But soon after our first meeting, and it's not totally aligned with EAB, our first meeting was in the fall of 2009, but in 2010, Maine implemented an emergency order to ban the importation or transportation of firewood from out of state into Maine. And it was partly a reflection of EAB, but also the Asian longhorn beetle was in Massachusetts. So there were lots of good reasons to try to keep firewood out of our state. And you can see up there, that's the first year. They actually, near the border, they would actually exchange firewood to get people used to the policy. And then, as part of our strategy, we wanted to really think about what is kind of happening across, in terms of the progression of EAB going across. It was first detected in Michigan. And it was actually Kelly Church, who was in the center of that group there, who's part of the Grand Traverse Band of Chippewa and Ottawa Indians. She actually had talked with basket makers, the Maine Indian Basketmakers Alliance, and talking about the emerald ash borer. And then Teresa Hoffman at that time, who was the director, contacted me here to see, could we start to do some work around this? It's a real concern. And that's kind of what started during in our effort. And so part of the meetings we had here in Maine also involved going to places where Kelly helped to organize trips in Michigan for our basketry harvesters and basket makers to see kind of the effects of EAB, kind of what it looked like, how it looked on the forest landscape. They got to get a sense of what to be aware of and what to be looking for here in Maine. Also met because a lot of the pioneering research around emerald ash borer was in Michigan at that time. And we met with some of the scientists there, and they actually got to see some of the cultural practices of our, of our basketry harvesters, pounding that ash tree to see, can you use that material that's been, infested with EAB. And you can see Kelly Church at the bottom. They're walking a forest, and one of the key issues for them at that time, as EAB was kind of going through that state and losing places where they used to harvest ash, was access. They couldn't get access to private lands. Landowners were not allowing access to harvest ash trees where they were growing and where they were healthy, and that was a huge concern early on for them, was just access to ash resources. And that was brought up during our meeting. Also met with and got involved with Les Benedict. And he has just been a phenomenal resource. And talk about a planner, in terms of, he developed a seed collection manual even before EAB was in the United States. He had a concern about, propagating black ash and thinking about how we might manage ash on the landscape. And so he had already started a lot of work that he was able to bring into our team. And of course, he was one of the first to develop emerald ash for kind of community response plan, well before EAB came to his community. So just a wealth of knowledge. And as part of this, again, you learn from so many people when we would go on these trips, but this is an individual, Jack Lazor, who used to work in the automotive industry. He's very mechanically inclined, created this very complex mechanical pounding machine. And that was the other thing that we were kind of looking for, was, is there a way that we might be able to rapidly process ash trees to try to save that material? And he had developed this really quite unique, elaborate, where he could be self-sufficient, do this all by himself with things that would bring the log up on top of this, roll it for him, and the pounding, it was just amazing. And that was something that he shared with us. And over the years, we've had a number of meetings here, and we actually had a research meeting where we brought scientists from the Great Lakes, Minnesota, where they had done a lot of work on the black ash, but also in Canada. And again, kind of getting a feel from them and going out in places here in Maine. And that's Butch Jacobs, Passamaquoddy basketry harvester in the bottom, and Eldon Hannon up on the top, who is also a harvester who supplies actually most of our basket makers here in the state. He's really active there. But as a result of this, we were able to publish this article in terms of kind of bringing more awareness of black ash. Nate Seegert with the U.S. Forest Service has also contributed greatly to our understanding of EAB, and again helping us plan looking forward. And with permission, I asked, he let me use a few of his slides just to kind of show some of his research findings. But again, as we think about the EAB invasion, what's important here are a couple things. One is that it actually takes some time for that EAB. It's in an area for a while, multiple years, 2 to 3 years, before it really starts to take off and multiply. As you can see, it's really after the 5-year, you can see a crest in EAB densities that takes place. And this has really important implications that I'll refer to later with some of our outreach and education efforts. What's a little disappointing, coinciding with that crest in the EAB densities, is the ash mortality. Extremely high, with 98% mortality happening where we have EAB. And again, this was based on some of the research that Nate was doing with his early work in Michigan, but again, kind of expanding that out to other areas where he's also doing work in New Hampshire and thankfully now here in Maine. The other thing, in terms of looking at the susceptibility of our native ash trees, we have 3: white, green, and black or brown. You know, there's many more, I think, but the key point here is that the black and green ash is the most preferred, most susceptible to EAB, which is something that we need to keep in mind. And again, you know, with that very high mortality, there could be some black ash still out there, but it's going to be almost like finding a needle in a haystack. That's why we're going to need to really focus in on our inventory and monitoring. So, you know, combined with the knowledge, you know, from the basket tree harvesters, the scientists, Nate, others doing work with wasps, other kind of things, a lot of information was being generated. And after these meetings in Maine, our research meeting, several years later, we also had a research colloquium meeting in Vermont. Again, kind of bringing kind of the latest science. And this time really even, again, those kind of continuing to do work with black ash, because most of the early research around EAB focused on the commercially valuable white and the green that were in cities and municipalities. And so we were just kind of catching up with the research on the black ash. And this was another great meeting to kind of bring that knowledge together. And really kind of as an outgrowth of that particular meeting, this just came out fairly recently in terms of thinking about 10 recommendations for managing ash. That's Tony D'Amato, University of Vermont, and Amanda Mahaffey with the Forest Guild. And they've been doing more workshops. We're working together with them in coming up with these recommendations for managing ash. And what I really like about this document is that it's starting to be grounded in research data, you know, with the recommendations that are being suggested. Again, it takes time to get that data and support, but a lot of these recommendations are kind of based on science, things what they're seeing on the ground. And that's important, right? Just to kind of give you an indication of where EAB is now, but in 2016, we had the infestation in New Hampshire, and you can see the infested areas and the potential areas where it would be increasing. This was 2016. In 2018, we had our first detections here in Maine, first up in northern Maine. And interestingly, we really think in that case that it wasn't by firewood transport. It probably came across the river in Canada, but more of a biological coming into Maine. And while we have done, I think, a fabulous job kind of keeping EIB out of our state with the efforts that we've made, you know, it finally came in on the south from New Hampshire. And it's continuing to spreading more quickly in the southern regions of our state than the northern region. And you can see here that these areas are in a quarantine. And the idea here is that through the quarantine efforts, what we're going to try to do is just contain that, keep those infested trees localized as best as possible in those places. So it doesn't get transported outside those quarantine zones. So what's critically important related to quarantine is monitoring and seeing where EAB might be coming and moving. And you can see a variety of techniques that are employed. We have purple traps, green traps. We have girdled tree, which is part of our trap tree network that landowners become involved in. And we also have a native Cerceris wasp that goes after EAB, and we kind of use that as a monitoring when it brings it back to its nest. So you can see that we have monitoring throughout the state. More localized right on the fringe where that quarantine zone is, so that we can track where it might be moving next. But importantly, it's really, we have throughout Maine, because as we know with the transport of firewood, it can just pop and move 100 miles, 200 miles from one area to another. So that's why we need to have monitoring on a large scale here in Maine. And I think, depressing as it might seem, I do think that there appears to be some level of hope, in terms of thinking about strategies where we might be able to preserve ash on, in a forested landscape. And currently I'm working with Tony and Amanda, Nate, and other folks on a framework we're calling around ash preservation management. And what I wanted to share with you is just some of the elements of that ash preservation management framework. And first and foremost, what's important is to have an inventory of your ash. And then as you have an inventory, then you can start to monitor those ash trees in relationship to if EAB is coming in or proximity to where EAB is. So inventorying and monitoring is extremely important. And this is Tyler Everett. He's my PhD student who has developed a ash inventory manual. It's kind of a living document where we're kind of adding more information. But the idea here is that this inventory manual is used for not only just documenting where ash trees are growing, but getting more fine-tuned data as to what species of ash, what is the sex of that ash, because in most cases, as we're learning, most ash trees are male. So maybe we try to, locate, identify those female ash trees and have those as a high priority for future seed collection. Where are they growing? Other data that could be helpful for implementation of silvicultural in terms of looking at age structure, age size classes of ash, because again, that gets into the recommendations that we'll be formulating for what ash we might want to try to keep on that landscape during, say, even a harvesting process. What ash can we retain on that in that area? So it's more detailed information, but the idea here is that you could potentially implement efforts with seed collection, biological controls, and chemical or insecticide treatments. And this happened just before COVID. We had our first field training here in the University Forest with tribal foresters and the state foresters with ash tree harvesters at this meeting. And since then, Tyler has also worked with the Native youth in terms of some of this effort. Another piece, like I mentioned before, is this idea of seed collection and banking, or seed banking. And what's important here is the idea of collecting seed from a variety of different places. Again, referring back to some of our early meetings and the differences, different characteristics that ash shows depending on where it grows. The qualities, we really feel that there probably are some genetic diversity even within the black ash species, right? And hopefully we can find some that might be more resistant to EAB. So we really are looking to really have a seed collection on a geographic scale, and in particularly where we tend to find quality basket grade trees. And again, Les Benedict and Richard David, early pioneers with the seed collection manual and efforts, have really provided valuable experience. We now have seed collection kits that we're ready to start collecting this summer and fall. we got the list from them as to what we needed. And that's going to be going to the tribal communities very shortly. And you'll notice I've got these puzzle pieces here because it's really kind of all of these kind of pieces that I think, that we think that need to fit together if we want to try to have ash coexisting with EAB on that landscape. And so another aspect are kind of the silvicultural forest practices that we might be looking at to apply on the ground. And so the idea here is retaining those ash seed-bearing trees. We still need male trees, right, for the pollen. So locating, inventorying those, determining the sex of those trees, a various size class, right? You're going to need to have mature trees for seed-bearing trees, right? So it's not just young trees, it's a real range of trees that we want to try to keep on that landscape. And it's not that we're keeping all trees, right? EAB is going to eventually kill most of them, right? So you could still have some harvesting going on, but it's thinking thoughtfully about how you might leave some of those ash trees on that landscape. And as we move forward, silviculture is going to, kind of those forest practices are also going to be important in terms of what openings that we might try to create for those seedlings to grow as other trees come in and other things. So there's a real strong kind of forest practice component that's necessary. This may be a little controversial for some. I think it's something that we still need to think through thoughtfully, but the idea of chemical controls, we are looking at different treatments, and some treatments are more effective than others. They've been mostly applied in terms of protecting and saving trees in municipalities and homes where they have value that you want to try to retain those. And really it's really been, over the past 3, 4, 5 years that we've been looking at applying this in a forested setting. And the idea here is mostly in terms of protecting those trees so that we have a live seed source. We have trees that will still produce seed in those forested settings. And there also appears to be a beneficial effect if you treat one, which is a trunk injected application. So it kind of stays with the tree, but it seems to have an effect in protecting trees that surround that protected tree to some degree. So again, more needs to be known, but this is, again, another kind of puzzle piece that I think we might want to be considering. The other is biological controls, both native and non-native. And this kind of shows here, this is a document from the APHIS. It basically shows by county where we have parasitoids, non-native parasitoids, that is kind of the natural enemy to the emerald ash borer. And you can see in the red is where they have been released. We have some that have been released here in Maine. Because they report by county, I just caution you that they're not spreading that far. In a way, it might be good, but it's really a tiny portion where that red should be showing here in Maine, but they have been released. And so for the native biocontrols, importantly, we have woodpeckers that really are an important component with EAB populations, showing that they really play a role in controlling the EAB population levels. Certainly not to a level where it can just keep it balanced, but it is a significant part. We also have the native wasp, which I talked about earlier. That's where the red arrow shows those two. We also have the non-native biocontrols that are released. And again, these are kind of the natural enemy of EAB. And each of these different wasps have their own niche, if you will, in terms of kind of controlling EAB. Some focus on the egg, some lay eggs on the lava, drill a hole in the bark of the ash and lay its eggs on the lava, which then the eggs feed off the lava and kind of kill EAB that way. So those three species also can kind of play a role where, again, what we're thinking about here is creating a situation where we're having ash trees coexisting in an environment where we have EAB. The other area is thinking about developing genetically resistant trees. And again, this is a plot where we had some propagation efforts and replanting in New York with some of Les's work. But the idea here is that finding those lingering, those ash trees that are showing some resistance to EAB and kind of hybridizing, kind of making an ash tree that can show resistance and kind of live in coexistence with the emerald ash borer. And this takes time. But again, we're showing some promise here with green ash. The U.S. Forest Service has done where they've got green ash now where it can coexist with EAB in heavily populated areas. We have green ash growing. No work yet on the black ash, but hopefully we'll be able to do that soon. So what are some of the important next steps? This is kind of my wheelhouse as a social scientist, but again, kind of doubling down on outreach and education. That primary movement of why it moved so quickly from Michigan over here to Maine was through the transportation of firewood, not the biological kind of movement of its flight. So we really need to continue our efforts with our message about transportation around firewood. And I think there's some evidence that our outreach and education is working. It's kind of setting in. It does take time for people's behavior to change. You know, people can form attitudes, but still sometimes their behavior doesn't reflect the attitudes that they have. And the study that I did along with other colleagues looking at campers in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, you know, kind of showed that, you know, most people, nearly 3/4 didn't bring firewood to them when they went camping, but 1/4 of them did. All of them had fairly high, what we call kind of involvement. They were concerned about the effects of invasive species. It mattered to them. They didn't have a very good recall about certain invasive species like emerald, very poor recall, unless we mention the name and then they, oh yeah, okay, EAB. So we still need more outreach and education to kind of connect certain invasives with things that the damage they can cause. But the point, I think one of the important findings I found through this work was that even though they had relatively high levels of involvement, they're concerned, it mattered to them. And in some cases, they even knew, okay, yeah, emerald ash borer, I know that. They still brought firewood. And so we really kind of need to understand the thinking, right? The decision-making that's being made. And in those cases, they thought their firewood was safe. They brought it from home, they thought it was safe. And plus they wanted to save some money. You know, so we kind of need to continue to think through some of our arguments. And you can see where I highlighted here, where we might need some of that emphasis, because most of our effort so far has been, for many years now, with keeping firewood out of our state. But now that EAB is in our state, we really need to start thinking about the possibility of people in our state either selling firewood to campers in our state, or them just going camping someplace, right, and bringing their firewood from home. So having more emphasis on the situation here in Maine with EAB in our state. I volunteered a few weeks ago at the Vacation Land RV and Camping Show. And the Maine Forest Service has some great outreach material that I was able to share with the campers there. Again, a lot of interest, you know, from from campers. Still, some thinking that their firewood might be safe if they just bring it from their home. I heard that from several of the campers that kind of went through that booth area. That's on the left there is Emily Francis, one of my other grad students. But on the right is Charlotte Hayes, who works with the Soil and Water District Conservation, Oxford County. She did a great job with the outreach effort, but again, we kind of need more effort there in bringing awareness. A nice display in the most recent Maine camping guide, which is good. And we've also had more media attention, and we've had some stories in the Woodlands magazine and other places where I think there's more information that's getting out there that I think is really needed to try to bring more awareness. I think in the near future, we're going to probably need to think about firewood in different ways, not only just for camping, but how people use it to heat their homes. If they have camps, bringing firewood up to their camp and lake. And where is that firewood sourced? Where are they getting that? I think that's something that we're going to probably need to focus on. Obviously, we're going to continue with some of the increased efforts around inventorying and monitoring. Ash trees is not a huge component of our forest. It's, roughly 4% of the hardwood stands of our forest, 2% of the forest in total. And especially black ash, it's typically not part of an inventory if people have a forest management plan. So one thing that I think would be really nice is to consider that as a component of yours if you're developing a forest management plan. Again, just for monitoring efforts and decisions that you might be able to make if you know what you have on your land. And even if you don't have a forest management plan, I think there's real value in monitoring so that decisions can be made with trees that might be on your property. Tony D'Amato says timing is everything. As we think about some of our strategies, it helps inform large and small private landowners. Implementation of emergency response plans for towns and municipalities and how they want to deal with EAB, especially if they want to treat those trees before EAB comes. So really important as we think about monitoring. And again, if we have that inventory, and if it's we know where ash trees are growing, that certainly could help with seed collection efforts. And one thing I didn't mention is that ash trees don't produce seed every year. It can be up to 5 years, some intervals sometimes for these trees to produce seed. So having that inventory and monitoring will help in future seed collection efforts. And again, I think, with more of the inventory that we have, it just creates more opportunities as we think through these ash preservation management goals and strategies and seeing if it's a right fit for them. I just wanted to circle back again, kind of thinking about these cultural lifeways. And again, I think I mentioned just some of the learning that I've done, as part of this process. You may have seen that this a part of that poster, but it's a poster that's in my office in Nutting Hall. That was given to me early on. I've had it ever since I've started teaching here at the university in 1998. And that's Richard Syllaboy with a lot more hair. And who was in that video. And I laugh and jokingly, but the point I want to make here is that Richard has had a long time connection and concern about ash trees and forest health. This was a poster that was created with some of the work that was looking at the dieback occurring in brown ash long before EAB was here. And Richard was out there kind of assessing the health of ash trees. And so thinking through these cultural lifeways, I think in some cases there's a real inherent long-term concern connection to those resources that I think is really important and valuable. And another colleague who I've gotten to know, and I think some of you may have read her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. But, you know, as we think about cultural lifeways and cultural practice, it's really what's important. Part of that is the doing. It's the doing that really instills those meanings, those values. You know, retaining that identity that's so important. And so, can we find ways to kind of keep those practices going? To, you know, sustaining cultural lifeways, I think, is really, really important. You know, one of the things that has happened with you know, this difficulty of EAB, you know, Les Benedict really brings out a good point. You know, even with the threats of EAB, you know, one thing that it has done, it's really been a mechanism for reestablishing connections, tribe to tribe, working together, finding solutions. And it's not, you know, Akwesasne, but it's Great Lake regions and other folks where we've been kind of doing more networking and sharing of information and ways to kind of sustain those cultural practices. Really, really important. There's Richard again with some of my students, but we actually went on some property with a nature conservancy, finding ways that we might be able to create opportunities for more access. Remember, I mentioned access being a real issue on private lands, and we've had a really good effort, you know, people reaching out to try to want to retain the access and cultural lifeways, but also thinking about how they might help us see collection efforts and monitoring and maybe implementation of some of the strategies that we're creating, which I think is really promising. Earlier this year, we had a landowner survey of Maine landowners, those that live in Maine, but even those that don't live in Maine but own land in Maine, and looking to learn more about what they plan to do around their ash, their knowledge of ash as a cultural keystone species, and what would, you know, what could influence their decisions to provide access or consider strategies to retain ash on that landscape. So we'll be looking at that. We had over 600 respondents to our surveys. So I think that's an indication of some interest in landowners wanting to learn more about emerald ash borer. And just the continued community sharing that's important as we learn more, get more people interested in this is really important. And efforts that are being done since EAB has been in the Mohawk Akwesasne territory for a while. They're implementing some of these strategies. We're going to monitor how those things are working. So having connection to them will be very important. I just want to acknowledge these folks. All the entities here on these acknowledgements helped me with this presentation, providing slides and information. It's a great group of people to work with. I look forward to continued collaborations. And I'll end it there. Sorry, we ran a little over on time, but we do have, I think, Allison and.
Right. So what I was going to suggest, if people need to leave, totally understand. We kind of had some technical problems, especially for the audience that's here virtually. If they're able to stay, Linda, I bet you have some things that have come in via the chat, and let's go ahead and do that. And for anybody that can stay, that's great. And hi, Linda.
You know, I think I probably speak for everyone who's here that we wouldn't have had you not say any of the things that you did so that we would have time to have questions, because we learned so much from everything John, that you helped us learn and think about. In the chat, some of the early questions and repeated questions more or less are on the theme of how do we get involved? How do we learn more about this? People were very interested in, you did such a great job of capturing that this is a multifaceted issue and that it matters for all kinds of reasons in terms of basket making, in terms of just all kinds of different things. And you helped us see that. And over again, and people asked some questions about this, you showed how many different groups are important. We need to understand how basket makers are thinking about things. We need to understand what scientists are studying. We need to understand our own actions with firewood. And we need to be thinking about the next generation and what kind of training that could be offered. The video that you showed was so informative, just really informative in terms of us thinking about this wicked problem and how important it is to have different groups involved. And some of the people in the chat were saying, you know, you've been working on this for a really long time. There are also other groups they mentioned like that have been working for 13 years. And people sort of asking, how do we not give up? You've captured such an important, complicated system. How do we not give up?
Thanks, Linda. And thanks for those that contributed on the chat. Are there any specific questions?
Well, people asked that they wanted to know what they could do, how they could be involved. They were so happy that you mentioned there is some hope, but it takes time. So if you could mention 2 or 3 ways people might get involved. We had people here from Maine Audubon. We had people here who are students. We had people here from state agencies. We had people here who are teachers. And they and basket makers, they want to know with the ecological significance, the economic, the cultural, what would you recommend? Do you have any? They could follow you around, but what do you have any recommendations?
Yes, and Gary Fish, who's also with the Maine, yes, a great resource is the Maine Forest Service website.
Great.
On the emerald ash borer. And again, finding out more information about firewood, best management practices and movement of wood, learning more about the quarantine, because that's going to be expanding over time. It's a great resource to find, you know, where it is currently. And also with help with monitoring. Colleen Tierling helps to, along with other Maine Forest Service folks, but she helps to manage the trap tree network, working with landowners for helping to monitor for EAB. But clearly, I think we're also going to need to have more outreach, you know, thinking of through the 10 management practices. Those are relatively new, and we need to be informing the foresters, landowners, making them more aware of options that exist. So.
And people were so interested that you really said there are now these 10 recommendations for managing the ash, and that they're grounded in data. That one of the needs that you were pointing out to us is to have good data, and that we're in for a long term. You gave us hope because you said it takes time, but we're making some progress. And that it really is something that we can all learn best, not as individuals, but working together across our different skill levels, our different levels of thinking about community, our spiritual levels, being individual landowners, being people who are working with various groups that preserve land. And so people were really quite interested in thinking about, okay, how do we take all these lessons and where do we look for information, and how do we become not a part of the problem, but a part of the solution? And I know that we have run over, but oh my, this is just a wonderful talk, and we will all benefit from having come and hearing you talk. And we will all, I think, encourage our friends who weren't able to listen today to watch the video of you once it's up. So everyone, can we give a thanks again for this great opportunity to learn?